The Maiden of the Forest by pumpkinmoose22, Chapter 8. Before we get started, I'm probably going to cry during this. The walk to the king's private bedroom seemed to take an eternity. Kit's mind was harrowed up with memories, good and bad. The last conversation he had had with his father had been a sour one. He wouldn't let that be the last one they ever shared. He made it to his father's room. Captain Alistair was standing at the door with the 4 attendants in yellow overcoats stood within. Kit's eyes briefly met with the captain's. They were filled with grief. Kit walked inside. The physician inclined his head, unwilling to meet his inquiring gaze. Kit swallowed, though it was rather difficult to do so. Already his eyes were beginning to sting with unshed tears. The king lay in his bed, his skin pale, his breath shallow. "Oh, you've come," he gasped. "Good." Overcome with deep, great sorrow, Kit deeply frowned. "Oh, father, don't go," he pled. "I must," he said as Kit sat down beside him, clasping his hand. "You needn't be alone. Take a bride. The Princess Shalina. What if I commanded you to do so?" Kit had been afraid his father would do something like this, but he had made up his mind. He knew the only way for him to be the man the kingdom needed him to be. He had to marry for love, even if it meant defying the one man he respected more than anyone else in the entire world. Kit's minuscule smile was brave as he looked at his father, his heart breaking while he shook his head. "I love you and respect you, but I will not." Taking a deep breath, he continued, "I believe that we need not look outside our borders for strength or guidance. What we need is right before us, and we need only have courage and be kind to see it." King Rowan stared at him for a moment. "Just so. You've become your own man," he replied, weakly but proud. "Good. Then perhaps, in the little time left to me, I can become the father you deserve." Kit's eyes filled with tears as his father drew a haggard breath. "You must not marry for advantage. You must marry for love. Find that girl. Find her. The one they are all talking about. The forgetful one who loses her shoes." Kit finished with him. Both chuckled. "Oh, be cheerful, boy," King Rowan sighed. "Thank you, father," Kit whispered tenderly. His heart was breaking. In his last breaths, his father had softened and eased his troubled heart. "Thank you, Kit," the king whispered. Those few words conveyed more meaning to Kit than anything else. A tear fell down his face. His father smiled up at him. "I love you, son." "I love you, father," he replied, his voice choked with emotion. King Rowan lifted his arm, and Kit bent down, placing his head against his chest. His father rested his hand tenderly across him and breathed his last breaths. Kit's heart broke as he curled up on the bed, tears unrestrained as they fell in rivulets down his cheeks. His father was gone. Ella was in the middle of scrubbing floors, bubbles flowing all around each time she plunged her hand into the wash bucket to dampen her rag. Her hands, arms and back ached. Her stepmother had given her a huge list to complete early the next morning, something she only did when she was in a particularly foul mood. Ella believed it was because neither Anastasia nor Drizella were able to secure the hands on their prince. A small, secretive smile had claimed Ella's face all day, and she tried to hide it from her stepmother and stepsisters by wearing her hair loose. Now she was doing the floors, however. She had to have it out of the way so she could get down and scrub the grout in the dining room, which was covered in splatters of food. She was a little upset because she's sure the floor hadn't been this dirty when she cleaned it 4 days ago. Ella didn't like accusations, however, so she merely wrote it off as being the result of heartily consumed meals. Sighing, she sat back to move the pail of water closer towards her, when quite suddenly, and rather unexpectedly, there was a knock on the door. Wiping her hands off, she went to answer it. The young man standing before her was a royal page, the insignia on his black uniform the crest of the royal seal. The fact that he was wearing black caused Ella's breath to hitch and hand rest over her heart. The page sensed that this servant girl knew what news he brought. Grimly, with deep sadness, he gave his message. His Majesty, King Rowan, passed away this 27th day in August. Long live the King! I have been instructed to inform all who dwell in this region to wear black attire for the next week, in respect to His Majesty's passing. His Highness, Prince Christopher, will ascend to the throne tomorrow, but has requested a mourning period for his father to be extended for 3 weeks. Regular attire may be worn once more than a week's time if one feels so inclined. Ella's tears spilled down her cheeks. The page's own eyes misted over. Ella cleared her constricted throat enough to say, "Thank you for bringing us this terrible news, my good sir. Tell His Highness that he has our prayers and our hearts and sorrow with him." The page seemed surprised by this, but he merely sniffed, nodded, and walked dejectedly back over to his horse. Ella closed the door, her heart breaking a little. All she wanted to do was leave this wretched place and run off to Kit, to comfort him. She knew how he must be feeling. She had been alone in mourning her father's death, and now it appeared he would be alone too. But there was nothing she could do. The palace would never admit her, a soot-covered servant girl, to see the soon-to-be king. The nearest she'd ever be able to get was the gate, and everyone else was sure to be there too to show their support. Poor Kit. He was going to be crowned king, have all the responsibilities shoved upon his shoulders, and barely have any time to mourn his father. Distractions were nice, but private time to grieve was definitely helpful in the healing process. Forcing away her silent sobs and wiping the tears from her face, Ella composed her countenance so she could go and inform her stepmother and stepsisters of the message that had just been delivered. There had to be something she could do, she silently thought as she drew near the sitting room. An idea formed, and Ella filled with determination. She'd have to be sneaky, but if she waited for the right moment, she could slip away without anyone's notice. Music lessons, which lasted 2 hours, were never to be disturbed, and the next one was tomorrow. Making up her mind to execute her plan, Ella took several deep breaths and walked in to deliver the news that she knew not only broke her heart, but her dear Kit's as well. Kit had lied over his father's body for a good half-hour, sobbing openly into the white nightgown covering his chest. His mind had been racked with grief, his stomach clenching painfully. His throat was raw from the uncontrolled sobs, and his eyes hurt from the continuous tears streaming down his cheeks. And it seemed as if they would become a permanent fixture in his life. He couldn't believe it. His father was gone. No longer could they banter. No longer could he go to him for advice. No longer could he escape from the gilded cage he knew one day he'd have to enter for the rest of his life. His father had been set free, and now it was his turn to take on the responsibilities of the kingdom. He had been taught his entire life what he needed to do, but it still terrified him. An entire kingdom now rested solely on his shoulders. He had none to share it with him, but at least his father could put some of the burden on his shoulders. But now he had to carry the entire load alone. He knew that the others just in the hall could hear his cries of anguish, but he didn't care. He needed to express himself. The grief plaguing throughout his soul was deep and unmanageable, a wild beast that refused to be tamed until it was ready to be. Thankfully, the others didn't disturb him, giving him this moment to caress the shell of the man he had loved since birth. The warmth of his hand was still pressed into Kit's back, as if a faint imprint of him was still there. Kit bit his lower lip, in an attempt to stop the onslaught of emotion, but the pain only intensified. The choked gasp was more strangled from before, as it came out of his repressed state with a force that shocked his entire body into a slight convulsion. Kit's hands tightened on his father's shirt, his heart aching, his stomach clenching. Would this grief ever stop? Slowly, ever so slowly, his deep, shuddering breaths calmed, and the tears stopped pouring from his eyes. Then there came the emptiness. The feeling of being utterly alone. This was somehow worse than the sobs. Kit swallowed, his throat smarting from the movement. His eyes remained shut, his face buried in his father's chest, his fists holding onto the white shirt beneath him, as if in a vain hope his father would come back to him if he kept holding him as tightly as he could. Faintly, as if from another realm, Kit heard the approach of hesitant footsteps. Another hand, warmer than the one that belonged to his father, rested on his shoulder. Kit looked up and saw Captain Alistair. The coloured man's cheeks were wet, and his eyes were rimmed with red from his tears. Utter grief furrowed his brow and pulled his lips into a deep frown. Kit took a ragged breath before pushing himself off his father and into the captain's outstretched arms. Captain Alistair was all he had left. The brother in everything but blood. There was a person he could draw comfort, some strength, some comfort from. Kit didn't realise that he was crying again, his tears soiling the captain's dark uniform. Captain Alistair didn't soothe him with any words. He merely held on to him. He knew, without Kit having to tell him, that he needed to give him strength for, at this moment, he had none himself. Kit schooled his emotions again and pulled away. I apologise, my friend. I fear I have ruined your jacket. He tried to smile, but his lips wouldn't lift. Kit, Captain Alistair whispered, pulling him back into his chest. I am so sorry. Kit fought down another wave of tears. Taking a long, deep breath, he nodded, before gently removing himself from the embrace. Thank you, Alistair. I fear I am going to be in great need of your assistance in the coming days. I will always be here, he promised. I know, Kit muttered. Captain Alistair excused himself for a moment to order a bucket of ice water and a fresh towel to be brought in for Kit to rest against his face. As the command was softly spoken, Kit looked at his father and was struck by how peaceful he appeared. He had slipped into the next life without a shadow of worry or regret. The second he had told Kit to find the girl who lost her slipper, his countenance had changed. He was ready to move on. Kit had seen the faith in his eyes, that he no longer had to worry about leaving him alone. In hindsight, it was a miracle he was able to perceive this revelation when he did. He was so consumed with grief that he hardly thought of anything else but the last conversation with his father, playing through his mind. He was telling Kit he didn't want him to waste away mourning his death. He wanted him to move forward, to be cheerful, and to take the bride who would bring him a lifetime of happiness. But Kit needed to grieve. He remembered when his mother had died. He and his father had mourned for almost 4 months, and even after that it was still hard to finally pick up the pieces and press on. Kit determined that he needed some space. He didn't want his mystery princess to come to a place possessed with loss. He wanted to be able to welcome her with a smile. His decision made, he sent up a prayer that even though he would allow himself time to drift them apart, when the time came, he could fulfill his father's desire and find the owner of the glass slipper. Ella barely slept that night. She lay in her bed, tossing and turning, thinking of Kit and the sorrow he must be facing. Hers was a constant prayer in his behalf, asking that he might be able to somehow feel how much she longed to hold him in her arms and kiss his sorrows away. She had decided to write him a letter, one speaking from the heart and filled with courage and kindness towards him, his father, and his situation. Her plan was to leave it in the clearing in the woods, in the same tree he had hidden his invitation to her from the ball. She knew that she would have to make it visible, so she was going to the small clearing she knew of that possessed wildflowers. She couldn't afford any other. Finally, the sun rose, and after tying back her hair in a black ribbon, for that was the only black item of clothing she had to give her respects, Ella performed her chores as usual. She worked a little faster, so she could have time to slip away during the music lesson, to take place an hour after lunch. After cleaning away the now empty dishes, she hastily carried everything down to the kitchen, and hastily ate everything that was left. A piece of bread, some cheese, and a handful of grapes. She made sure to save some for the mice, setting up the teacup table near their hole they usually appeared at, with the little scraps of food on top. She would have waited for them to eat with them, but time was precious. She tucked the note to Kit in a cupboard in the kitchen, so she wouldn't have to climb the winding staircase up into the attic again. Grabbing the letter, she rushed out the door the second she heard Anastasia's dreadful voice fill the manor. Galahad was grazing in the small paddock she had placed him in first thing that morning. Yanking the fence open, she rushed in and expertly managed to climb onto his back. "Please, take me to the clearing, Galahad," she whispered in his ear. "The one where we met Kit." Her horse nickered a little but didn't move. Ella smiled. "I'll give you a whole bushel of apples." That caused a reaction. Galahad happily tossed his head before breaking into a canter. Ella's fist dug into his mane as she leant forward to keep herself astride. Galahad's canter became a gallop as his hooves met the main road. Riding through the forest, he managed to bring Ella to her desired location in no time at all. Ella hopped down, walking around and patted her horse. "Good boy," she soothed before hugging him. "I shall be back in a moment. I want you to stay here, all right? I need to find some flowers." Galahad stayed put while she wandered away from the clearing. She knew where there was a patch of wildflowers she was looking for. After a little bit of searching, she found them. A whole sea of them in full bloom, their tiny blue petals and soft yellow centre causing her a wave of pleasure. Ella gathered up her pink apron and began plucking flowers while singing softly the tune her mother used to sing to her when she was little. I'm not a very good singer, but I'll sing this line. "Lavender's green, dilly dilly, lavender's blue." Ella's bouquet was small and rather insignificant compared to the majestic roses Kit had given to her, but this was the best she could give. It would have to do. Twisting a small piece of twine she had brought with her around the stems of the flowers, she hurried back to the clearing where Galahad still stood faithfully waiting for her. Stepping up to the tree, she gently nudged the letter into the crack of the base of the hollow opening, resting the tiny bouquet next to it. She stepped back and let out a breath. "I don't know if he will even see this, Galahad," she sighed, "but this is all I can do." She walked back over to him, mounted, and turned to go back to the manor. She briefly paused and looked up into the late summer air. "Fairy godmother," she whispered aloud, "if you can hear me, I want to say thank you for helping me go to the ball and reuniting with Mr. Kit. His father passed yesterday, and I have no way to comfort him. I am leaving him this note and these flowers, and well, I was hoping you could keep a spell to keep the flowers alive, so that when he finds them they are fresh. If it's not too much to ask, that is. I want to give him the best I have, and I'd rather he had fresh flowers than dark ones. I want to fill him with life, not further death. I know I shouldn't ask this of you, but it would mean the world to me if you could indulge this request. Thank you again for all your kindness." Ella waited for a few moments, not sure what to expect. When nothing happened, she merely smiled. She had come to grips long ago not to expect to get everything she wanted. She was merely grateful that she was able to speak her thoughts aloud to her fairy godmother, in faith that she was listening. Patting Galahad's neck, she sighed. "Come on, boy, let's go home." As they ran away, the little blue flowers in the tree sparkled while another soft laugh sounded from the wood. Kit woke the next morning without any desire to arise, but he had to. Today he was going to be crowned the new king of Eretus. It was going to be a simple coronation due to the unfortunate circumstances of his father's passing. Before he died, he and Kit had discussed the idea of passing the crown to him shortly after the ball. Well, that was going to happen, but now it would be done without his father's presence. Kit twisted onto his side, and his eyes immediately landed on the glass slipper, sitting on his bedside table. He observed it for several minutes. "I will look for you," he promised aloud, "but I don't want you to see me like this. When I am ready to move forward, I'll go to wherever you are. I promise." There was a soft knock on the door. Sighing, Kit sat up. "Enter." Henry, Lance, and Captain Alistair came into the room, all wearing black. "Your Highness, the chapel should be ready for the crowning ceremony in an hour," Captain Alistair informed him. Kit frowned and looked at his window. The curtains had been drawn. They hadn't been drawn like that since his mother had passed. He liked the sunlight, so requested to have them open at all times. "What time is it?" he asked. "Almost noon, sire," Henry answered hesitantly. Kit let out a heavy sigh. "You didn't have to let me sleep so much. Surely there is much to do since yesterday." "You needed rest, Highness," Lance argued. "The Grand Duke is handling all affairs today. All you have to do is make an appearance at the coronation. The people have been lining the streets for hours, awaiting to pay their respects to your father and show their support for you as our new king." "Then we shouldn't keep them waiting," Kit whispered. Tradition called for him to wear the customary colours of blue and gold for the ceremony, so while everyone else would be wearing the respected colour of mourning, he would be paraded around like a peacock. Kit found it almost infuriating that he was the one whose grief was the deepest, but he wasn't about to let it soil his ancestry by breaking protocol. Getting out of bed, he found that hot water had already been dumped into the tub waiting for him. He hadn't even heard the servants come in. Had he really been that exhausted? He supposed so. Grief really took a toll on the body, and Kit was experiencing it in full force. Feeling empty, he dipped himself into the warm water and thoughtlessly bathed. When he was finished, he stepped out, dried himself off, and dressed in a pair of black pants and a white undershirt. Henry and Lance stood waiting, with a lovely blue vest and golden yellow jacket. Kit allowed them to slip the clothing over his arms, his thoughts and grief keeping him from engaging with them in conversation. While Henry tied a blue cravat around his neck, Lance placed a pure white sash over his shoulder. Kit then stepped into a pair of perfectly polished black boots, before Lance hooked a handsome sword onto the side of his black belt. Henry combed his hair back, styling it in the usual fashion. Both servants stepped back after this and bowed slightly to him. Kit looked at his reflection in the mirror and saw a man full of sorrow. His blue eyes had lost their gleam, and a frown slightly creased his brow. Besides his current state, he appeared every inch the future king. "Thank you, Lance. Thank you, Henry," he muttered. "It is our pleasure, your Highness," Henry replied. Kit swallowed as Lance handed him a pair of black gloves. "Your courage is ready, sire, whenever you are." Closing his eyes, Kit took a deep breath to steady himself. He looked around his room. This was the last time he would call it his. When he returned, he would move into the king's chambers. During the coronation, the servants would be cleaning them out and moving all of his previous belongings there. Kit noticed the glass slipper. Picking it up, he turned to his manservants. "I am ready," he said firmly. Though he wouldn't admit it to anyone, he was taking the shoe for the sake of motivation to have courage and go through with this ceremony and treat his people with the kindness they deserved despite his unhappiness. The slipper was also the representation for his future wife, and if that was all he could take with him to the coronation, then so be it. A piece of her was better than none at all. As he emerged from his chambers, the Grand Duke, Captain Alistair, and several members of the court, along with a handful of guards, stood waiting for him. All of them bowed slightly before straightening to follow him down the hall. None of them said a word about the slipper. In fact, none of them said a word at all. Kit walked with his head held high, forcing himself not to think about how mere days ago his father had walked down these very halls. Prudence had ordered that all drapes be closed. Black floral arrangements lined the walls every few feet, and everywhere Kit went, each person he passed sported the colour of death. When he reached the palace entrance, the royal staff had been assembled to see him off. He had grown up with them all. They had known him as a boy, and now they would know him as a man. Prudence held an expression of mingled sorrow and pride. She nodded silently to him when their eyes met, and gave him a minuscule smile. Kit merely inclined his head, his hands still clasped around the slipper. The carriage that would take him to the chapel was a sleek dark blue with gold trim, the 4 horses pulling it along, the colour of midnight. The royal guard, already on horseback, were positioned in front and behind, ready to leave as soon as he gave the order. In the distance, Kit could see people lining up on the streets on either side, their faces looking to him. Though he couldn't make out their expressions, he could feel their bittersweet emotions. Keeping his own in check, he stepped down the path and up into the carriage. He noticed the flags were all flying half-mast, several black ones combined with the standard of blue and gold that was displayed all year round. After a few minutes of waiting for the members of the court, the captain and the Grand Duke to mount their steeds, the latter appeared outside his carriage. "We are ready when you are, sire," he stated. Kit gave the nod of consent, and the procession began. There was no cheering, there was no laughter. The people were just as grave as their soon-to-be king. The women threw yellow and blue roses into the street as the carriage passed, but besides the colours of the town, were black. Kit made sure to nod at the people periodically to show his gratitude, but he never sent them a smile. He didn't have any to give. It was surreal, but not even 2 days ago prior, the kingdom had been filled with excitement, happiness, and laughter, when now it was so dull, sorrowful, and grave. Kit was not looking forward to the funeral, which was to take place in 3 days. He would have to endure a similar procession to this one, and once more place himself under a facade. He had to be strong for his subjects, even if his heart was choking with inner sobs behind his ribcage. Thanks to the ball taking place the day before the king's sudden passing, the inns and most of the guest rooms in the palace were still occupied by the neighbouring nobility and foreign princesses that had attended the event, so many members of the surrounding kingdoms were in attendance for the coronation. They were sad for the kingdom of Veritas, but unlike the people, their grief was only given with half a heart. They had other things on their minds, and this unfortunate occurrence had caused many of them to have to set sail for their own countries later than scheduled. But they were about to welcome a new colleague, the new king of Veritas, and therefore understood the importance of being in his good graces for future possibilities. Kit didn't really care if there were other members of royalty at his coronation or not. The 2 people he wanted there most were not, unable to come due to separation of death, and the other due to his obligations concerning lizards and pumpkins and things. At this thought, though he didn't realise it, a small corner of Kit's mouth lifted. They reached the chapel 10 minutes later. Kit stepped out of the carriage, and waiting in the hall while the members of court and the Grand Duke filed past him to take their places near the front of the room. The captain was about to follow them, and Kit called out quietly, "Captain Alistair?" The captain stopped. Kit held out the glass slipper. "Hold this for me?" The captain took it gently in his hands. "It would be my honour, Your Majesty." Kit drew a haggard breath. This was the first time anyone addressed him in this way, for this title was reserved for the king. "Thank you," he muttered. The captain nodded, before walking down the chapel aisle to take his seat at the front. Already Kit missed the warmth the slipper had represented to him. He would have loved to take it with him to the altar, but that would have sent the wrong message. He sighed over his misfortune, and then the voice of a beautiful memory filtered through his nerves and grief, pouring comfort and assurance into the cracks of his soul. "Others have it worse, I am sure. We must simply have courage and be kind, mustn't we?" Have courage, be kind. Have courage, be kind. He needed to have the courage to walk down that aisle and take up his birthright. He had to be kind and accept the responsibilities of king with humility and a willing heart. Kit closed his eyes, and the thought of his princess and her warm smile, her goodness and her spirit. Though not present, the memory of her would help him take those steps down the aisle. Then he thought of his father and the love, pride and faith he had in him. The former king had always believed that he would one day be a great king. He had never doubted him. There was no reason for Kit to doubt himself. Thinking of his father kept the wounds on his soul wide open, but Kit needed to draw strength, and it was courageous to face one's hardship in difficulties such as this. He took another deep breath, and forced his negative feelings away. A servant stepped forward shortly after that, and placed a thick blue robe across his shoulders, the edges lined with a royal white fur spotted with little pieces of black. Once the robe was in place, Kit moved to stand in front of the aisle. Soft organ music began, and the throngs of people within the room stood and turned to face him. "Have courage and be kind," her voice rang in his mind. Kit thought of her. Her words are balm to his aching soul. He forced the first step forward, and sooner than he would have thought, he was standing at the altar. The high priest began the ceremony after everyone had taken their seats. Kit spoke the specific vow he was supposed to, and performed the way he had been taught his whole life. And then came the moment. The high priest took the magnificent blue crown, encased under arches of crafted gold, from a pillow on which it rested, spoke a blessing, and placed it upon Kit's head. Accepting the golden staff with shining sapphires from the high priest, Kit rose to his feet and turned to face the public. "Long live His Majesty, King Christopher!" As Kit looked over the masses, he tried not to break the small amount of courage within his breast. He thought of his people and his kingdom, and felt the responsibility and burden of the crown upon his head. He also felt an increased love and devotion to them. As their king, he vowed then and there to do all he could to rule them with courage and kindness, and his first royal proclamation, as king, would ensure this to come to pass. For after the time for mourning, he was going to declare his marriage to the mysterious princess who wore glass slippers to the ball. He felt more strongly than ever before that she was the key to renew his people's hopes and transition the kingdom into happiness. With her by his side, the kingdom would not only flourish, it would be transformed. Seized with this hope, Kit gathered his courage and walked down the aisle out into the sun to face a life of being a king. End of chapter 8. Hey guys, Whew, that was really, really hard. I'd like to give a quick moment. If any of you are mourning, I am truly sorry if this triggered anything for you. I myself have known loss, and that was really, really hard. It's one of the best descriptions of grief I've ever read. Oh boy. But onto the things I like about this. It shows that they are human. Alistair being a brother to Kit. Ella doing everything she can to send him her love with that little forget-me-not bloom, bouquet and note. Kit holding the slipper on the way to the coronation and having his pseudo-brother hold it while he walks there. Having Ella's words give Kit what he needed to push through. It's very, very powerful. Anyway, remember to like, comment and subscribe and hit that bell to get notified whenever I upload a new video. Have a good day, night or whatever time zone you're in. Bye my guys, gals and non-binary pals. I'll see you in another chapter and hopefully it'll be a bit more jolly. Bye!